everyone. Welcome back. So great to see you all. Thank you. So, as I mentioned in the last class, today we're going to be discussing our blind spots, which are essentially self-imposed or created constraints preventing us from being fully aware and living an easeful life. And a couple of years I came across a talk at Stanford University given by an author named Mo Gawdat, and it's M-O, stands for Mohammed, and Gawdat, G-A-W-D-A-T. And he wrote a book called Solve for Happy. But originally, he actually wasn't an author. For over 20 years, he worked as an engineer at IBM and Microsoft, and then was eventually recruited to be the chief business officer at Google X, which is their think tank that gets to design all the coolest things that you can throw any money at. So he did that, which is just to say that on top of even that, he was also a co-founder of 20 startups. So very, very successful in the corporate world. He was also married, and he had 2 children, and a son and a daughter. And so really quite perfect life, right? Everything you could possibly want. And yet he wasn't very happy. And in fact, his son said to him, "You really come at work and at life from your mind, and you need to work on coming from the heart." And that proved to be a very important statement, because shortly after that, Ali, his son, died on the operating table from a simple miscalculation during an appendectomy, and he was only 21. And Ali was Mo's best friend and a mentor. They played video games together, and he just really looked up to Ali. So when Ali passed away, it really transformed him, and he said, there has to be some good in this. And so he really decided to turn his life around and bring everything he could coming from the heart. And so he started a movement called Solve for Happy, in which he was going to initially make 10,000 people happy, but it was so successful. He changed the goal to 1 million people, and he's still going on. So in 2016, he wrote this book, and he gave a series of talks at Stanford University, going through his entire happiness model. And so that's where I'm taking the blind spots from, his very, very detailed model on how you be happy. And the idea is that he thinks most people think they have to be successful in order to be happy. And what Mo thinks is that once you're happy, you'll know how to be successful. So it was interesting that he gave the talk at Stanford, because of course, in the first part, he does ask the students, like, what do you want to be? What are you looking for in your life? And almost no one said they wanted to be happy. They all said, I want to be a molecular biologist. I want to be an astrophysicist. So the idea was to, while they're young and at the beginning of this wonderful career, could they think about making the right choices early on? And so it's a very fascinating series of talks. There are actually 8 of them. So it almost runs for 8 hours, and I'll put the link in the email that I send out. But it's really, really fascinating. So as an engineer, he came up with a very simple formula, he said, for happiness. And it is, happiness is greater than or equal to the perception of the events in your life minus your expectations of how life should be. So let me repeat that. Happiness is greater than or equal to the perceptions of the events in your life at the moment minus your expectations of how life should be. So I just want to clarify that, because it may sound like, well, if you lower your expectations, that means you'll be happy. But that is not the case. The case is you should have expectations, you should have goals, but you should be flexible enough to be able to change those or pivot when situations beyond your control or situations change at the current moment, and maybe you need to do different things or do them in different ways. So it's really more about being flexible than not having expectations, because we can't help but have expectations. It's important to have ideas and thoughts and where you want to be and how you want to live. So, But just being able to be flexible enough to adapt to those, to your current situation, is how you can find ease in your life. So on top of that small formula, he has what he calls the happiness model, which is 675. So we're going to go through those. I'm going to focus on the 7 part, which is the blind spots. But the 6 is what he calls the 6 grand illusions. And we've really gone over these in other classes in different ways. But these are the things he says you should see through. And they are thoughts. So we've had a whole class on thoughts awareness. Self, we just did one on our bodies and ourselves. Fear is a future-based idea, and we've talked about how we can get caught in, again, these expectations and filling ourselves with fear. Entitlement, which is the idea of I should have, or it should be, or it should have been. So again, around these expectations, they can really trip you up. Knowledge, what you think you know, what you know, what you know you don't know, what you don't know you don't know. These are all things that can really create illusions for yourself. And then time, which is really, really important. And in fact, I want to do a whole series just on time because we haven't delved into it too much. But anyway, as he said, these are the 6 illusions: thought, self, fear, entitlement, knowledge, and time. Now, the 7 are what we're going to discuss today. So these are the 7 blind spots. And he said, these are things you can fix. So I'll just go over them very quickly and then we'll dive in. So it's filters, assumptions, predictions, memories, labels, emotions, and exaggeration. And so I think we can dive in a little bit as to what he actually means when he talks about these things. So filters are things that actually come in handy. Your brain actually can't take in all of the information that it's being confronted with all the time through our senses. So it filters out information it feels is not relevant to you at that time. So it deems what's important and what's not important. And that can be helpful in that it makes it easy for you to operate in this world and not be overwhelmed. But on the other hand, your brain can filter out things that really could be very, very important. And I'm going to put a link in the email, but one of the really most salient examples of this is there was a test that they gave participants where they asked them to watch these basketball players and count the numbers in the white shirts of the baskets they made. And so you become extremely focused on the people in the white shirts. And what happens is they send in a gorilla and stands in the middle of the frame for a couple of seconds and then leaves. And they asked people later on if anybody had seen anything strange. And a very, very high percentage of people said they'd never seen anything. They didn't see the gorilla. They weren't watching because they were so focused. Their vision was so focused on these white shirts that it filtered out all the other relevant information. So that can happen with our other senses. So filters is one way that we can have blinders on. Assumptions. I think we all can relate to making assumptions. It's something we do naturally. It makes things easier for us, and our brains are really attuned to taking the path of least resistance. As we know, when we talked about Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, this is really part of the system 1, which says, I don't want to work too hard to figure something out. So why don't I just rely on things in the past that always worked? And those would be our assumptions. So the idea is it can present a false picture of the world. And at least it can be personal based or societal based, such as something like systemic racism. But assumptions can definitely, if they're not investigated correctly, lead to incorrect assessments of the world. Predictions. Well, as we spoke about last time when we talked about the Lisa Barrett, Feldman Barrett talk, where she says emotions are really just predictions or guesses. So these are future states that we have assumed take place, but they are not true because they haven't happened yet. And in the way that we can't get in a future breath, we can't assume that no, something will happen in the future when it really hasn't existed yet. So basing a lot of fear is a future-based a sentiment. So basing a lot of decisions and understanding of the world on a future that doesn't yet exist can definitely be illusory. Memories. So this is really just the other version of predictions because it's based on past events. And we know that memory is completely fallible. And that's why when we go and we see trials and you hear witnesses describe events, depending on who saw what, when, and how long ago it was, people's interpretations of what happened can be completely different. In fact, there's a very famous movie made in the 1960s by a Japanese filmmaker named Akira Kurosawa called Rashomon. And basically he has an event happen and then he interviews 7 witnesses to this event and they all tell a different story. So memories are really just our own filters of what we see as the truth, and they can be mistaken. So again, not to rely 100% on memories. Labels. So we talk about labels a lot in mindfulness because it's one way to decontextualize an emotion. So if you're feeling charged, they go, oh, that is fear, that is anger, and it takes it out of the story of how you got there, what it means, and it minimizes it. And in the same way, labels decontextualize, any kind of situation. So you could say, that is old, that is that's just a thing I never like to do. That is, that's a food I don't like. And it could be that this time the food is, made in a different way, and it's worth trying again. So it's important to really not assume, again, this is another form of assumption, that because it has been told to you that way, because other people perceive it that way, because society deems it to be such, that it necessarily is so. And the last one is exaggeration, which I think is really easy to understand. I think when we say it's always like this, or it's never like that, we're usually using it in order to justify a statement that may or may not be true. But if we add that kind of adjective of always or never, that gives it a sense of validity and reality that it might not necessarily have in and of itself. So when you go, I always have to do this, I always act like that, we know that's probably just an inflated justification for your opinion. So again, these are filters that and constraints that allow us to not be fully present, to not be fully aware. And it's basically our brains taking the path of least resistance in order not to really work a little harder and investigate what's really there. So it's just to say, be aware of these. We can't really change our behavior all the time, but just know maybe when you after having heard this talk, that you could be aware, oh, that's really just an assumption, or that's a label I learned from somewhere else, or I'm exaggerating now. And so, of course, being an engineer, Mo also came up with what he calls debugging the brain's code. So this is how we can turn off or at least dampen some of these blind spots. So filtering, he says, just remember there may be more to investigate, right? And see what you might have left out of your initial assessment of things. In terms of assumptions, just first recognize what you're doing, and then maybe bring a beginner's mind to whatever you're looking at. See it with fresh eyes, as if you've never seen it before, and investigate it in a way that might allow an openness and a new understanding. Predictions. Again, we know that we are going to make predictions, but just understand that that's what they are, and they aren't necessarily what's going to happen. And if they change, again, with our expectations, allow our predictions to also change. But we don't want to get too caught up in that fear state, that future state, so that we no longer are alive enough in the present state. And that's the same with memories, but it's just referring to the past. And there's a lovely quote, which I'd heard many times, and it seems that Lily Tomlin said it, but she said, forgiveness means to give up all hope for a better past. But we can't really change the past. It's gone. It's important to keep those learnings with us. It's important not to forget them totally, but it's also important not to live totally in that time zone. And as I said, we're going to talk about time zones later, but being present allows us to be fully aware of who we are, where we are now, and it includes the past and includes the future. But again, it's that sense of equanimity and balance that we talked about in the last class that allows us not to get too wrapped up in either of those states. And then, of course, labels, again, just check it at the door and see if it's still relevant. See if you adopted it for a long time ago and maybe it doesn't really hold true anymore. And begin to investigate with that new awareness. Emotions, well, we talk about that all the time. Labeling the emotion can help, but just also becoming aware, kind of stepping outside so you're not so emotionally charged and maybe not thinking as clearly as if you were totally wrapped up in that emotion. But we've talked about that all the time. And, create that gap as we talked about last time. Have that capacious, spacious feeling. So just not getting too wrapped up in your emotions. And exaggeration. So just be wary when you use terms like always and never. I think that one will be the easiest to try and watch for. I know I tend to say, I never eat eggplant. And I'm not allergic to it or something. But one time I used to eat eggplant. So I'm going to have to try and eat eggplant again. I think that's only fair. So those are just the 7 blind spots that, again, the reason I'm highlighting these are the ones we can be aware of. These are the ones we can investigate. And these are the ones we can hopefully, change and not allow them to be this constraint for living what Mo would call a happier life. And I would call maybe an easeful life. And for the last part of his formula, which is the 5 of the 6, 7, 5, these are the 5 ultimate truths, which we can also talk about in the next class, which is where we should stay anchored. And that is the now. We've certainly gone over being in the present. Change, how things change all the time. If we are aware of change and welcoming change and knowing things will change, it won't be so difficult when things do actually change. Love, loving kindness, compassion. We have certainly gone over that in many cases, in many situations. Bringing it first to yourself and offering it to others. If you rest in that, that will definitely bring you an easeful life. Death, it's hard to avoid that. We haven't spent a lot of time on it, but it's just a fact of life. And it just is something we do need to be aware of and be okay with, because things are living and dying all the time. And we did go over that in our class on the body. And then his last one is design. And what he really means is just the universality, this grandness that is way beyond us, and to be aligned with that. And I love that feeling, because that really does go along with what I've been talking about in terms of embodied awareness, embodied presence, that spaciousness we bring in, that connection that's beyond our individual self-centered mind, and the connection to a much larger energy field, a larger awareness of the earth and breath that brings an expansiveness to our lives. So I must say, I really was moved by his talk, and I think you will be too. And so I'll put the links in the email that I send out. And you might want to read his book as well. It's really wonderful. I think if we are just aware of those tools, we can we can pierce through those illusions, pierce through those storm clouds, and bring clarity and ease to our life. So great. Well, thank you all. I think we should do a meditation now. Thank you.